So you can turn to page 7 in your syllabus. And I was tasked with teaching the topic of Jesus Christ being the subject of the entire work. And when I proposed that we start Genesis and see how far we could get by lunchtime on Sunday, it was rejected. So what I'm choosing to do instead is focus on Jesus Christ in his role as a high priest. And yeah, there you go. How's that?
That's better.
All right. Put this up here. So we're going to look at Jesus Christ first as a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So as most of you probably know, Jesus Christ is first introduced in Genesis 3:15, where God proposes his plan for salvation. Right? He would he would crush the head of the serpent, and the serpent would bruise Jesus Christ's heel. And really, that the word bruise that we see in Genesis 3:15, we know that it means crush. Jesus Christ was going to crush the head of the serpent, which is the adversary. Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, if you're not familiar with it. But next we want to look at Abraham and his meeting with this priest Melchizedek. So we can go to Genesis chapter 14 to start. And what we're going to see is there's only a couple of verses about Melchizedek here, and if you were reading, say you were reading through the whole book of Genesis, it would be pretty easy to miss. You might say, oh, Melchizedek, okay, and by the time you get to the next chapter, forget about him. But what we'll see is he was a very, very significant figure in terms of establishing a model or a type for Jesus Christ. So the context here in Genesis chapter 14 is that basically this king Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and 3 other kings were kind of allied, and they get in a war with a group of 5 other kings, including the king of Sodom. And you may remember that Abraham's nephew Lot lived in Sodom, right? When they got there, Abraham and Lot's men, they're the people that took care of their livestock, they weren't getting along well, so Abraham said, I'll go one direction, you go the other, you pick first, I'll go the other way. So Lot and his guys went to Sodom, and Abraham and his guys went to Canaan, I believe. So basically, Lot is living in Sodom when the king of Sodom and these 4 other kings kind of get into a war, and that's the context here. So in verse 14 of Genesis 14, we'll start. And when Abraham heard that his brother was taken captive, so Lot was taken captive in the course of this war, this battle, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. I don't know about you guys, but you read earlier where Abraham gets up and leaves his home and where he grew up, and you think, okay, people leave and go to California all the time or something like that. Well, here he's got a militia of over 300 people just, available to him personally in his household. So when he got up and left, he had a lot of things to take with him. So he sends his 300 men, 318 to be exact. In verse 15, he divided himself against them and his servants by night and smote them and pursued them to Hobah, which is on the left hand of Damascus. And he brought back all the goods and also brought again his brother Lot and his goods and the women also and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him after his return from the slaughter of Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him at the valley of Shaveh, which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine. And he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, which hath delivered thine enemies into thy hand. And he gave him tithes of all. And he, Abraham, gave Melchizedek tithes of all. So again, you might miss Melchizedek there and the one mention he gets and a couple of verses of attention he gets. But I want to note a few things here. First, Melchizedek was the king of Salem, which could also be translated king of peace. When he met Abraham, he brought bread and wine. And Melchizedek was the priest of the Most High God. It's interesting that he was both king and priest. So he was a priest, if you want to say it that way. And then it says Abraham gave Melchizedek tithes of all, or a tenth of all the spoils he had taken when he, retrieved Lot and beat Chedorlaomer's allied forces. So, considering a couple of these things we read about Melchizedek, it might sound familiar from the law, but it's important to note here that this meeting between Abraham and Melchizedek occurred more than 400 years before God gave Moses the law. So that's just something to note, and we'll see the significance of things as we go through. Next, let's go to Psalm 110. Psalm 110 is the only other mention of Melchizedek until we get to the book of Hebrews. So a whopping 2 mentions in the entire Old Testament here. But again, don't let it deceive you as far as significance. Psalm 110, we'll start in verse 1. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. Okay, so the Lord, which here is Jehovah, so God, said unto my Lord, and that's Lord with, in the King James, Lord with lowercase letters after the L. Sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. The Lord shall send out the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. Thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. The Lord hath sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so here Melchizedek comes up again. We're going to see that this prophecy in Psalm 110 is regarding Jesus Christ. But it says that thou art a priest forever after the Lord, or after the order of Melchizedek. And this is something that God, the Lord here again is Jehovah, is swearing. This is an oath that God is making. All right? So let's go to Hebrews. We're going to spend a lot of time in Hebrews this evening. And if you know anything about the book of Hebrews, it's really addressed to those Jews that maybe after Jesus Christ came, maybe they were still hung up on the law a little bit, or they were having trouble accepting Jesus Christ. I was thinking about this. We're going through a weird time right now with the COVID-19 situation. But, there's kids growing up that are, I don't know, maybe, I guess I'll see when Ellie gets a little older, but developmentally they start developing memories and actually remembering things like later in life and observing things around them. So there's probably kids that are right in that age range that are growing up, and the first permanent memories they're making are people wearing masks and socially distancing and stuff like that, right? So whenever we get out of this thing, hopefully soon, but whenever we get out of it, it's probably going to be a little bit of adjustment to not have to stay 6 feet from people, or not go to school or school and have to wear a mask, right? It's going to be like, I'm not supposed to do that. That's going to be their gut reaction maybe. So it's interesting, maybe we'll see that. So imagine the children of Israel going from the time of Moses up through the time of Jesus Christ under the law, and then being told, nope, throw it all out. Doesn't count anymore. And, as we look at the law and the role of the high priest, and if you read Leviticus, there was a lot that was expected of the children of Israel law. So surprising that some of them needed convincing to change something that was ingrained in their grandfathers, their great-grandfathers' way of life, and their culture. But that's what the book of Hebrews is doing, is it's using the Old Testament to demonstrate that Jesus Christ was that promised Messiah. So that's the context of Hebrews. And that's why we get to read so much about Jesus Christ here and his relation to the Old Testament. So in Hebrews chapter 6, we'll look at verse 19. Which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. We'll look at that soon. Whither the forerunner is for us entered, even Jesus, made an high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So there's our confirmation that what we read in Psalm 110 was indeed talking about Jesus Christ. So what does it mean when it says that Jesus Christ would be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek? Again, it might be easy to gloss over that and say, well, he'd be similar or something like that, kind of just read it and infer something about it, but it's a little more significant than that. If you want to look at the bottom of page 7 in your syllabus, I have a little thing here. So the Hebrew word in Psalm 110:4 is dibra, meaning manner, mode, suit, or style. And then in Hebrews, the Greek word is taxis, meaning regular arrangement that is in time or fixed succession of rank or character. This is what Strong's has. So it's a succession or an arrangement or something like that. So if we want to look at what it's talking about here, we can go read about Zacharias in Luke chapter 1, and I'll ask you to turn there to Luke chapter 1. So while you're turning there, I'm bad at multitasking, like turning and talking. So this order, it was a priestly order, and it was something that was established in 1 Chronicles 24 as David was transferring being king to his son Solomon, and they were about to build the permanent temple. They had the tabernacle in the wilderness for 40 years. So finally, David was handing over the reins to Solomon, and Solomon was going to build the permanent temple. And in that process, they established 24 priestly courses. So the priests were all descendants of Levi, descendants of Abraham directly, and sons of Aaron and things like that. So they established these courses, and once those courses were established with specific families, then the descendants of each family would continue to follow that course. And what we're going to see, cutting it out?
Yeah, it's very boring.
Okay. All right, I'll talk louder. All right, so they established these priestly courses, and what we're going to see here in in Luke chapter 1, I told you to go to, I have to get there, is Zacharias, who was the father of John the Baptist. And that's a really good record in itself, especially with relation to the birth of Jesus Christ. But I just wanted to look at it because it mentions these priestly courses and the course that Zacharias was a part of. So we'll start in verse 5. It says, "There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judah, a certain priest named Zacharias of the course of Abiah." So if you go back to 1 Chronicles chapter 24, you'll see Abijah with a J. But that's Abiah that's being referred to here. And so Zacharias was of the course that was started back at the time of David and Solomon with Abijah or Abiah. So it was kind of like a shift. And his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. And they had no child because that Elizabeth was barren, and they were both now well stricken in years. And it came to pass that while he executed the priest's office before God in the order of his course, according to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of the Lord. So here in verse 7 and 8, you can see he's executing the priest's office in the order of his course. Okay, so there were these 24 courses, and those descendants of the people called out in 1 Chronicles 24 would follow this course. There were 24 cycles. They would pause for feasts where all the priests would show up at the feast. They'd resume the cycles. So sometimes they'd have once a year, sometimes twice a year, depends on the calendar, right? So when it says that Jesus Christ would be a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, it might look like a problem because Melchizedek is not mentioned in 1 Chronicles chapter 24. So how is it possible that Jesus Christ could be a high priest after the course of Melchizedek if Melchizedek wasn't one of the orders? And that's an important point we're going to keep looking at here. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 7. This is a high-density teaching. I hope you're following along. And we're really going to work through most of chapter 7 in Hebrews here, but We'll start in verse 1. It says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace." So Salem is translated peace. That's where king of peace comes from. King of righteousness comes from the Hebrew version of Melchizedek, where Melech means king, and Tzedek means right or just or righteous. So that's where we get king of righteousness, which is pretty cool. Verse 3, "Without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually." Now, did Melchizedek have a father and mother? Yes. Well, yes, because he was there. And, did he have an end? Did he eventually die? Well, we know that the word says that Jesus Christ is the only one to have been raised from the dead and stayed that way. So it is a very safe conclusion that Melchizedek did in fact die at some point. But the point here is this information is not recorded. Again, we only got 1 or 2 verses back in Genesis about Melchizedek, but God intentionally didn't record it because it wasn't significant to his priesthood. Remember, the priests under the law were specific descendants of those ordered in 1 Chronicles 24, and then going back to the very beginning, they were descendants of Levi or Aaron. So your family lineage was absolutely foundational to you being a high priest or being a priest at all. So the fact that Melchizedek's family heritage isn't listed is very significant. All right? So let's keep going here in verse 4. "Now consider how this man was, unto whom even the patriarch Abraham gave the tenth of the spoils. And verily they that are sons of Levi who receive the office of the priesthood," again sons of Levi, "have a commandment to take tithes of the people according to the law, that is their brethren, though they come out of the loins of Abraham. But he whose descent is not counted from them received tithes of Abraham, and blessed him that had the promises. And without all contradiction, without any doubt, the less is blessed of the better." So again, remember the book of Hebrews is trying to convince those Jews who were not accepting Jesus Christ that Christ was the guy, right? And so what this is doing here is it's saying, the patriarch Abraham, and you look back and throughout the epistles and Acts, and Jews are always saying, we're sons of Abraham, right? So it's saying Abraham gave tithes to this guy who was not a priest under the law. He was a priest some other way, and even Abraham gave tithes to this priest. So clearly this priest was greater than Abraham, who your priests are descendants of. So this guy's way up here is what this little section is saying, okay? Let's keep reading. Verse 8. "And here men that die receive tithes, but there he receiveth them of whom it is witnessed that he liveth. And as I may so say, Levi also who receiveth tithe paid tithes in Abraham, for he was yet in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him." So the writer here is saying, technically, even Levi gave Melchizedek tithes because he was technically in Abraham's loins. He wasn't born yet. So, "If therefore perfection were by the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise after the order of Melchizedek, and not be called after the order of Aaron? For the priesthood being changed, there is made of necessity a change also of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken pertaineth to another tribe, of which no man gave attendance at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord sprang out of Judah, of which the tribe Moses spake nothing concerning priesthood. And it is yet far more evident, for that after the similitude of Melchizedek there ariseth another priest, who is made not after the law of a carnal commandment, but after the power of an endless life. For he testifieth, thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Again, Psalm 110, verse 4. So again, Melchizedek and Jesus Christ's priesthood were established outside of the parameter of the law of Moses. Melchizedek and Abraham met over 400 years before the law was given to Moses. All right? And then let's keep reading here. For there is verily a disannulling of the commandment going before for the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. For the law made nothing perfect, but the bringing in of a better hope did, by which we draw nigh unto God. And inasmuch not without an oath, he was made high priest, or he was made priest. For those priests were made without an oath, but this with an oath, by him that said unto him, the Lord swear and will not repent, thou art a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. By so much was Jesus made a surety of a better testament. So again, Jesus Christ, Melchizedek and Jesus Christ, they were made priests by an oath. They weren't made priests just because they happened to be the descendant of the guy who was named in the law. They were specifically made priests by an oath of God, which is different than those Levitical or Aaronic priests under the law. Verse 23, and they truly were many priests because they were not suffered to continue by reason of death. Again, it's a safe assumption that if you're not Jesus Christ, you died at some point, if you were written about here in the Word. But this man, because he continueth forever, hath an unchangeable priesthood. Wherefore he is able also to save them to the uttermost that come to God unto God by him, seeing he ever liveth to make intercession for them. For such an high priest became us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and made higher than the heavens, who needeth not daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifice for his own sins, and then for the people's. For he did this once, when he offered up himself. For the law maketh men high priests which have infirmity, but the word of the oath, which was since the law, maketh the Son who is consecrated forevermore. So I put a handy-dandy comparison table in your syllabus. Let's take a look. On the left, you have the priests of Aaron or Levi, those under the law. And on the right, you have Melchizedek and Jesus Christ. So those under the law had a title of priest or high priest, if applicable. Whereas Melchizedek and Jesus Christ had both the titles of high priest and king of righteousness or king of peace. For Aaron and Levi, the priesthood was received based on being a descendant of Levi or Aaron and, further up, Abraham. Whereas Melchizedek and Jesus Christ, the priesthood was established by, the priesthood was not based on earthly family pedigree. Also, the priesthood was established by the law for those Aaron and Levites, whereas the priesthood for Jesus Christ and Melchizedek were established by an oath of God. And finally, the priesthood for the Aaronites and Levites ended with their death, whereas Jesus Christ has an unchangeable, unending priesthood, and Melchizedek's death is not recorded in the Word. So the one last thing I wanted to note, the Word doesn't explicitly say much about this connection, so we can't say much either unless we're making it up, and we don't want to do that. But it's noteworthy that after Lot was rescued from the bondage of being captured by Chedorlaomer's forces, Melchizedek brought bread and wine as an offering to God. The meal and drink offerings, actually it's called the meat offering in King James English, which is ironic because it's the only sacrifice that didn't involve meat or an animal. But it's really the meal offering and drink offerings were a key aspect of the sacrifices under the law. And Jesus Christ, during the Last Supper with his apostles before his crucifixion, instructs them to remember his accomplishments with bread and wine. And he freed us from the bondage of sin. So, we know that the law was a shadow of good things to come. It says that in Hebrews 10:1. But, even 400 years before the law, God was at work establishing the model or the type of Jesus Christ. And we're all the way back here in Genesis chapter 14. So, Jesus Christ truly is the subject of the whole Word. And we want to learn more about exactly how he served the role of high priest and how he is our high priest. But if you want to learn about that, you'll have to come back after the break.